We always are excited when we have someone with us who is one of those big brain people and does great work out there to keep us aware of issues that are important, not to just individuals, select individuals, but to the greater society that we live in. And with us this morning is professor, author, and human resources management consultant Dante King. Welcome to the show. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely, glad to have you with us this morning. You're a secret warrior in this conversation that so many people don't want to have. In terms of what's happening in terms of DEI in America, better employment practices, better hiring practices across the board. But tell us a little bit about your background in terms of your work at Mayo Clinic and some of the other things that you've done out on the West Coast in the medical field.
Sure. So I developed a curriculum, which was kind of the predicate for my first book, and now the second book that I'm releasing, titled Diagnosing Whiteness and Anti-Blackness. And it's really looking forensically at the colonial laws, state-level laws, and federal laws that developed and defined what it meant to be white, and what it meant to establish institutions that are modeled after a logic of whiteness and what it means to be white, and looking at how laws and policies were enforced for the benefit, upliftment, and stabilizing of people who are identified as white, as well as, because when we think about race or, the concept of white or black, these are just that. These are concepts. They're not real. They've not been defined legally or scientifically. And so when we look at the ascribing of rights and privileges, but also the taking away or apprehension of rights and privileges for people who are non-white identified, that's actually defining what those terms mean in terms of access and opportunity or the lack thereof. And so it's really a forensic look at race and how it also shaped the psychology and the politics and sociological aspects of our culture.
So I have this thing, Dante, that I'm going to refer to as Doc. I have this thing, Doc, that I say a lot, and that is when somebody of your experience and knowledge is talking. I'm a note taker. I come from this old school of writing, handwritten notes while you're, in class, and you know what I'm talking about. So
yeah.
I have to force myself sometimes when I'm listening to someone like you on our show, and not take notes and just listen. It's hard to not take notes because you'll say something and I'm like, oh yeah, I've been thinking about that for decades. And so kudos to you, because you just gave us like a baby master class. That, I guess it's kind of not congruent, but you just gave us a master class on something that a lot of people don't want to talk about. And that is, there's no such thing as in terms of scientific or legal definition of whiteness or blackness, as it were. And it's the only two designations. It's like the polar opposites, and then everybody else falls kind of in the middle. I mean, if you're Muslim by faith, are you black or are you white? If you were born in Mexico City, Mexico, and you live in the United States now, are you black or white? If you were born in Canada, in Edmonton, Canada, and then you move to the United States, are you now white because you were born in Canada because you're Canadian by color? And that is such a...
That's right.
Talk to us about that, because I need to shut up and listen and let other folks listen. Talk to us about that.
Well, I think what you just expounded upon is the reality that these concepts and what they mean depend on people's training and how people have been programmed to associate meaning to specific words, concepts, who people are. It's just like, for example, when you look at maybe 100 years ago when there were Jim Crow laws that prohibited black people, mixed race people from accessing certain institutions, businesses, schools, etc. And as long as someone who could pass for white, as long as white people presumed and believed that they were full white and not mixed, they were okay. Such was the case with the NAACP head Walter White. In the moment that it began to circulate that he was partly black, in his heritage, people became enraged. And so we're talking about people's psychological attachments to words and concepts and what they mean. And I think it's very important when we then look at, the foundations of our institutions, everything from our legal institutions, our educational institutions, they all function and were all created by white men for the purposes and benefits of white people. And you can go and look at the 1790 Naturalization Act, which is the first act passed by the first Congressional Congress pertaining to citizenship. And the predicate that is the basis for citizenship in the United States of America is whiteness. They named that very specifically. And so that then means every right, every privilege, every opportunity that is granted to this new country and its newly found citizens means that it's an opportunity and access hoarding for white people. And American institutions have continued to function both by the design of laws and the enforcement of laws and policies for the benefit of white people and specifically against people who are identified as black and or African American.
And more so in that crowd, because, let's just be honest, folks, and this is where America has a challenge, and this is not an indictment, it's just speaking reality. America has a challenge with acknowledging its ills. And in many cases,
absolutely.
And I'm not just talking about race necessarily or culture or gender, but in a lot of areas. And then that's when somebody from another country finds a way to come into our country. And I'm not talking about immigration and all that. I'm talking about they find a way to capitalize on our blindness. And that's one of the things that has been a deficiency of our country is its inability to acknowledge its imperfections. And as a result, it ends up the back door is, as I've said before, why are we fighting over crumbs, how the grass was cut in the front yard when the back door, the alley, the garage is wide open? And we, because of our inability to acknowledge these imperfections, and one of them is how we deal with race, how we deal with culture, how we deal with religion, we then have this big, trailer truck you can drive through what we want to say is great about the country. Now, I have to ask you this question. Why do you?
I agree. Can I comment on what you just said, though?
Sure. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Don.
Well, I think it's important to tease out in this moment exactly what you just said. And I want to register this person's name, not for the sake of critiquing him or his politics or anything that he stands for, but when we look at a person, for example, like Donald Trump, Donald Trump represents everything that America values and stands for. And I don't say that, to be smart or sarcastic, but when we think about the things that you just mentioned in terms of this country's history, the lack of accountability, it's a culture that is rooted and functions upon a foundation of narcissism. It does. And I think that we all, to a degree, are socialized with that. And this inability to be accountable for our misgivings, for our transgressions, things that we do, that doesn't feel good for anyone. But this culture really has done a phenomenal job at denying that things are what they are, that things have been what they've been. And I think when we look at someone like a Donald Trump, he represents the narcissism to its fullest extreme. He represents the celebrity that we value. He represents the economics of the equation. That's something that we're taught to strive for and see that we value highly. He represents the whiteness, the maleness. That is the epitome of the scale. And I just think we have to take an inventory of that and what our standards and values really are as a society.
When people say, and Doc, thanks for slowing me down on that, because that's a point that does need to be teased out a little bit more and more and more and more. Now, because when you tease something out, what happens? You get to the root of the problem. So I gotta say this and ask you this. To your point about the country's inability to do that, and then this Donald Trump being the representation, the uber representation of the ironically the counterintuitive wrong of the country. He's perpetuating this belief that he's the right with the country, but in fact he's the wrong with the country, and people have lined up to follow that wrongness, and it's hypocritical to what many people think that they are really following. And in actuality, this is who the country is. It just proved it when 75 plus million people voted for this thing that they say that we're better than, when in fact we're not better than that, because we just said that we're okay with all of these things that are counter and hypocritical to what the country actually says that it stands for. And that is the craziest bit of psychology that I think a lot of people have missed. They say that they think the country's better than this. This is not who we are. We can't be that way. But in fact, they leaned into it with both shoulders, like they were trying to stop a truck from backing down the hill.
That's right. That is right. And I think even if we are to give the majority of society the benefit of the doubt and say, most people were just really naive, they're functioning in a state of naivete, what would drive a culture of people to become this naive and or this ignorant? And I think we have to ask ourselves those questions. Much of it, at least in my view, is the distorting of history and the lack of teaching about the true history of this country, so that we understand what our mistakes, I don't know if I would even call them mistakes, but we understand what the evils and the ills were and are in this country. For example, there are 13 states right now requiring young girls and women to carry to term the babies of their rapists. If they were molested and raped by family members, fathers, stepfathers, uncles, grandfathers, they have to carry to term the babies of their rapists. We've been here before.
Yep.
That's the majority of this country's history.
Yeah.
Grooming men to rape women and then requiring the women to carry to term the babies of their rapists.
It's why my good friend and gentleman that I co-host another show with on our network called The Family Meeting. His name is Eric Grant. We talk about this all the time. The country it's living in this fog of we're better than this, and we're not. That's not who we are. I can't believe that it is exactly who the country is. The country just has a difficult time acknowledging that that's who the country is. Now, that doesn't mean that can't be aspirational about going forward. We frankly wouldn't have survived without the aspirational feeling and belief and desire to be better. But in reality, we've always had this. Sometimes I refer Dante to the country this way, as a drag race car. Those funny cars that drag race and then they pop a parachute to slow them down. Yes. I sometimes refer to the country as a drag race car with a parachute that pops out every now and again to remind the country you've got some history that you got to deal with. And if you don't, this parachute's going to pop back or pop out to drag you back every now and again. But the country doesn't want to acknowledge that parachute exists. And I'm a visual kind of person in terms of how I try to give ideas to people. That's how our country is. We got to get rid of the parachute. We got to acknowledge it, cut it off at its core before the country can just race on down the road without that parachute being attached to the rear end.
I love that analogy because it really, the ills and the unaddressed traumas of this country are slowing us down. They really are. As much as we preach about exceptionalism, we really could be exceptional if we were to atone for the things that have really tainted our culture and the cultural psychology of this place. So I appreciate your assessment.
Thank you. Well, I'm in a crowd of smartness, so I got to raise my game a little bit in terms of chatting with you. Listen, man, I want to ask you a question about something that's going on right now, and I think we saw it coming, and now it's in our faces, and that is companies are abandoning big companies, big name companies in an area of speciality for you, are abandoning their DEI protocols. And these are not just some small companies that, we may not know about. These are some big, major, national and have international presence companies. Why are they, excuse my language, why are they punking out?
Well, I'll say this. I think that it's in their best interest. There's been the company America's First Legal. They've been launching lawsuits against companies that, maintain these DEI programs. So when I think about it from an economic and a political standpoint, who wants to spend, 2 years in litigation, paying a ton of lawyers' fees, and then have to settle a lawsuit that you might lose. Yeah. And I think that once organizations moved away from, using or focusing on things that have a founding in law, a basis in law, such as the title programs, Title 6, 7, 8, 9, as well as the 1964 Civil Rights Act, it really put organizations at a risk. And so I've been consulting with leadership teams, and I've been telling them, focus on anti-discrimination, anti-racism, anti-harassment efforts. The notion around diversity, equity, and inclusion, when some of those programs are defined in ways that appear that they're excluding certain groups, that is when organizations find themselves at risk. Yeah. And I think organizations have to be more strategic about that. And use the data. Use the data that shows that in certain classifications or at certain levels within your organization, you've got a homogenous problem. Yeah. And we also have to begin to take to task the ways in which my sister, Caretha Mitchell, she talks about whiteness is not neutral. Whiteness is never neutral. And so if we act like it's neutral, we then, give this false idea that most white people are where they are based on the fact that they worked hard, based solely on merit, not that they were hired because of their race or given opportunity because of their race. We know that is the case. And so we have to interrogate the realities of things like white misconduct, white underperformance, white mediocrity, the deficiency that may show up in ways where it allows us to focus most of our time and attention on non-white people and their mediocrity and their deficiency. And there's a grave imbalance there as well. And so it calls for us as a society to really interrogate the biases that we hold, both favorable and unfavorable.
That's right. And we refer to that sometimes in the community as get your boy or get your girl. Call out the folks so that you can, the calling out process is about, I think we can own that in a different way. And that ownership it's not to denigrate necessarily. It's to find a way to get to the core of something and then make it better. And irrespective necessarily of the community. And you as an African-American man and American, me is the same. I think that we've done a really good job of calling out our boy. And then I look at oftentimes in sports, because let's be honest, team sports in America, certainly basketball and football, a little bit less in baseball, are dominated by African American men and women, depending on if we're talking about the NBA, the WNBA. But one of the things that's clear is that those athletes are known for calling out their fellow players and making sure that they raise their game. And that's not to say that white players don't do that. I'm not saying that anybody that's listening and getting your undies in a bundle. I'm saying to what Dante King is saying, we have to do a better job collectively in the employment world of calling out the deficiencies, good and bad, or irrespective of group, a little bit better. And the country's got to do a better job of calling itself out, rather than just running down the road thinking, oh, we do nothing wrong. We're great all the time. We're in no imperfections. We are just wonderful and perfect and yada, yada. No. The way to get better is to go, man, I shouldn't have eaten that third piece of cake last night. You know, I mean, and so sometimes it's so basic, Dante, I think, and that it's so simple to be able to do that and then be able to grow from there. I mean, is that, and I'm not getting a little bit over nuanced, but I'm only because what you're saying is so important, and so many more people need to tap into this. Let's stop fooling ourselves, and let's get on the train of how do we really make ourselves better. And I applaud you for the work you're doing.
You are spot on. It's not over nuanced at all. You are spot on. Let's be honest with ourselves, and we can address the problem.
Do you think that you may? And this is one of those addressing an issue. It's put out there, and I wanted to wait and talk about this next week. But since I have you on, I have to ask you this question. There are some people that are advocating. Speaking of calling out our history, there's some people that are out there advocating that urging President Biden to apologize for enslavement and take some other, essentially racial justice actions before leaving office. What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, we don't need any more apologies. They do nothing for us. I think instead they need to pass a bill around the monies that are owed to us. America has a line item on its balance sheet that goes directly to black people in this country. And it's not, people call it reparations. No, these are things that are owed to us. When we think about, for instance, President Abraham Lincoln signing into law the Homestead Acts, where with white people, he signed it into law when they were citizens. They were the only ones who were citizens. That was 1862. And that law benefited, for the most part, white immigrants and white citizens in the North and South who were here, who had to just go to a land office, complete an application, and then they were awarded 160 acres of land. Yep. And so we have to look at the disproportionality of laws and policies like that, as well as laws and policies around racial restrictive covenants. In the two U.S. Supreme Court rulings, 1926 Corrigan v. Buckley and Euclid v. Ambler, which stated that racial zoning and racial restrictive covenants were legally binding documents and processes. Yep. So we really are owed a huge debt.
And that the base word of reparations, and we're not talking about reparations, we're talking about the debt, as Dr. King spoke to so often, and Malcolm did as well, is about repairing a part of our country that has been damaged repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly. A good friend of mine says that a great part of our country, those folks who are African American or of African American descent, and many others, are in a constant state of PTSD. And we're the dominant community in that space. Yet, say the quote Native American brothers and sisters, but we are in a constant state of PTSD, and as a result of the country not dealing with that, the country's in a constant state of PTSD, and that's where we have to draw the line and take a page out of your book, no pun intended, and deal with that. Acknowledge it first, and say, all right, now let's figure out how we're going to go forward collectively. And boy, the deep breath that would be for the country would be massive. So, wow,
that's right. And I'll just say, if I can, you just captured the essence of my book that's coming out in February. I actually produced a docuseries about it, too. It's called Diagnosing Whiteness and Anti-Blackness, White Psychopathology, Collective Psychosis and Trauma in America. We are all suffering and in a collective psychosis and trauma.
So listen, let's have you back on around that time. I'll make sure that we get that plugged in so we can have you back on either right before or right after that comes out, because I'd love to talk about it and make sure that we can plug and push that for you as best possible. Does that sound okay?
That'll be great. Thank you.
Dante King, y'all, professor, author, and human resource management consultant, has been with us this morning. Thank you so much for taking the time. And man, oh man, my brain is on fire now. So Dante, thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you.
All right. Bye now.
Care.
Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.